Since the beginning of time, there's been one constant variable, and that is fanboys. Now, I've been watching a lot of things on television and on the internet, and everybody seems to have one question: how did fanboys originate? What happened? What made everybody go up in arms about what game's better and what exclusives we have, and why can't we all just get along in a sense? One world peace. One game system to rule them all. You know, first system to ever be called a fanboy was Odyssey versus the Atari 2600. Seeing as how the Atari 2600 came out after the Odyssey, had better graphics, and let you do a lot more, it was pretty obvious that the Odyssey fans were a little starstruck. But since their parents wouldn't pay pay for another game system, they had to kind of show that their game system was still superior in a way. And you might be thinking, how does the Odyssey come up to this? Come up to all of this? Alright, when the Odyssey was finally taken down by the Atari, people switched over, and it was Atari's world for just a little while, up until NES versus Sega. After Atari's failure, the NES, also known as the Famicom, and the Sega Genesis were released. Now, a lot of people were a little struck, seeing as how the price back then was a lot of money for something that was so unknown in the community of entertainment. So most people would only spend money on one system. So to really ask for both systems would kind of be a little crazy, and not a lot of people had them. Not even a lot of rich people had two systems, seeing as how it was kind of like TVs in the 60s. There weren't really any use for them. So the system that you chose was actually the system you were stuck with. That that started one of the most heated rivalries in video game history. The NES versus the Sega Genesis. The Sega Genesis had Sonic and a couple of other unknown titles, and the NES had Legend of Zelda, Mario, and a couple others. So, by the way I name it, you could probably tell that I was an NES fanboy. Yes, I will admit I was. Um, and all this carried on and on. And when the Super NES was released, you better believe that people with the Sega Genesis and all their attachments and everything were very, very mad. Seeing as how that they really never came out with another system. They just kept adding attachments to it to make the graphics look a little shiny, while Nintendo was making more money and more money and more money with their different systems added. All the stuff that they had, it was okay. It had a modem which allowed you to the internet, which was a new feature. But in the end, all of them doing was failing like its counterpart, seeing as how people couldn't really take it seriously from everything else that Sega had released. Personally, I was really sad about this one because of the fact that the Sega Saturn was a pretty good investment if they would have stayed. But PlayStation came out, and PlayStation blew them out of the water, seeing as how PlayStation didn't have 3D graphics, but they had the gore and the violence that when the Sega Dreamcast came out, it had pretty much amazing graphics. It blew everything else out of the water that had even been thought of. PlayStation and everything else were just a memory, a kind of glam compared to it. Sega really had their fan base. Nintendo was going off a different direction, and Sega was like, this is finally going to be our time, and it was for a short while. But due to some financial errors and a horrible, horrible, horrible history with money and all the other random miscellaneous things, Sega had to close down their business for good. Now, you might be thinking, since PlayStation took the Sega Saturn fans, don't you think that PlayStation 2 would have taken all of the Sega Dreamcast fans? No, actually. See, what happened was Sega decided we're going to let Microsoft and their new questionable system take over from here. The controller is remarkably the same as the Sega Dreamcast controller, and a lot of things look pretty much the same. I mean, the console is kind of shaped like it, and the games that came out for it were actually pretty good and were old exclusives for the Sega Dreamcast. A few things though, when Microsoft was in the middle of the whole console wars that year, didn't really have a huge fan base, but when Halo came out, they really grabbed the reins. Though PlayStation had Grand Theft Auto series, and Nintendo, though I haven't mentioned them, didn't really have a huge fan base, but gathered what little they had and showed that there are still people, still hardcore gamers, and still gamers all over the world that love them. When they released their Mario and their Legend of Zelda franchise games, which were amazing. I cannot tell you how many hours I spent playing Twilight Princess and Wind Waker over and over again. All of the fanboys for the PlayStation 2 felt like they were on top, seeing as how they always had the best game titles, hundreds upon hundreds, almost thousands of games actually, released for their console, most of which were really good, some of which not so great. But they always had good games. Microsoft had Halo. Halo was their only savior. They only had that game and a couple of the Grand Theft Auto releases after their exclusivity clause was up. The problem though was the GameCube. The console I chose, seeing as how I was a Nintendo fan from all those years, I think God kind of said, you know what, since you straight off the path by getting a Sega Dreamcast, I'm gonna make you pay, because Nintendo did the worst out of the entire franchise. It had no third party support for anything. You couldn't play DVDs, you couldn't, watch movies, you couldn't even all you could do was plug it up and play. There was no internet on it, so you couldn't play on the internet. And everybody everywhere was very upset about this whole feature, seeing as how everything else could play DVDs, and the GameCube was kind of left in the dark, and Nintendo with little to nothing. Nintendo pulled it out in the console wars, seeing as how they are the first with sales and relativity. Kids, adults, and even the elderly can play this console now. Seeing as how they're first in the console race technically with sales and overall just buzz. They have really taken the market over. And I have to say, this is what Nintendo is like. The only problem is they've kind of abandoned the hardcore gamers that have been with them since day one. Nowadays, PlayStation versus Xbox has been one of the biggest rivalries since the big one. I'm talking NES versus Sega. This is how big it is. People will go onto other message boards, lower the ratings for their videos just to make their game look a little better. And it's gotten out of control, and I just really cannot believe what's happened. I mean, I thought we learned from the past wars that no one comes out the victor. Everyone just comes out spoiled. Though now you don't really have to choose sides. Now that buying two systems is okay, having a Sony fan base and being an Xbox gamer is okay nowadays. So there aren't really that many fanboys. And I know I've been accused of being a fanboy here and there, but I really do respect Sony for what they've done in the past and what they're doing right now, seeing as how they're always trying to revolutionize their consoles and the consoles around them with the Blu-ray player and all of the other stuff that they've put on there, like, the internet. You can go on the internet with a PS3. And part 2 will be uploaded soon. I'm going to work on all the stuff that helped the transition. So if you want to see more of it, just subscribe to my page. And if you don't want to see more of it, subscribe to my page. I do a lot of movie stuff. I do a lot of other stuff. So subscribe. Come on, please.